welcome everybody to Nightmares Before Christmas. We're going to be talking about seasonal horror on screen, and we're very happy to have you all here. I'm going to hand over to our chair in just a moment after I've given him a proper introduction, and then he'll be joined by some fantastic panelists, and I hope that everybody is looking forward to this as much as I am. So chairing for us this evening is Dr. Ian Mann, who is a lecturer in film and media studies at Sheffield Hallam University. Craig is the author of Phases of the Moon, A Cultural History of the Werewolf Film, which is a fantastic book, and is currently researching his second monograph, Bleeding Us Dry, Independent American Horror and Anti-Capitalism. He's the convener of the Fear 2000 conference series, co-edits the 21st Century Horror book series at Edinburgh University Press, and unironically, he thinks that Gremlins is the greatest film ever made. I was going to introduce you as Gremlins' biggest fan, but I reckon you might have some competition on the panel, so I'll let you fight about that amongst yourselves. I'm going to hand over and leave it with you. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much to Laura, Shelley and Kate for asking me to chair this panel. It's a privilege. This is Nightmares Before Christmas, seasonal horror on screen. And this has been a very, very long semester that I feel maybe has aged me about 50 years. So I'm very much looking forward to an event where we're going to be talking about ghosts, gremlins and killer Santas. Yes, if you could hold your questions till we get to the Q&A section at the end of the event. And when you do put your questions in the chat, could you do me a favor and just save my eyes and put question in capital letters before it? It'd also be helpful if you're writing your question out in the chat, just to let me know whether you want me to ask that for you, whether you want me to relay it, or whether you would like to come on camera and ask it yourself, which you are perfectly, I'm perfectly happy for you to do. So what I'm going to do to just kick this event off is just introduce our speakers tonight, and then we'll get going. So first of all, we've got Dr. Derek Johnston. Dr. Derek Johnston is a lecturer in broadcast at Queen's University, Belfast. His book, Haunted Seasons, Television Ghost Stories for Christmas and Horror for Halloween, examines seasonal horror in television, as well as its lineage from radio and literature and earlier customs. He also edited a special issue of the Journal of Popular Television on television's seasonality, as well as a dossier for the same journal on Christmas television. He is currently working on an edited collection on Nigel Neal and horror for the Hidden Horror History series with Liverpool University Press, which is obviously run by our excellent SIG conveners here. Secondly, we have Dr. Steve Jones, who is Assistant Professor in Media and Film at Northumbria University. His research principally focuses on sex, violence, ethics and selfhood within horror and pornography. He is the author of Torture Porn, Popular Horror After Saw, and his forthcoming book, The Meta-Modern Slasher Film, will be published next year as part of the 21st Century Horror series at Edinburgh University Press. We've then got Dr. Catherine Lester, who is a lecturer in film and television at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on children's horror, as explored in her monograph, Horror Films for Children, Fear and Pleasure in American Cinema. She's also editor of the forthcoming open access collection, Watership Down, Perspectives on and Beyond Animated Violence, as well as author of several chapters and articles on children's media, animation, and their intersections with the horror genre. And finally, my own colleague from Sheffield Hallam University, we have Dr. Diane A. Rodgers, who is Senior Lecturer in Media, Arts and Communications, and co-founder of the Centre for Contemporary Legend at Sheffield Hallam University. She specialises in teaching alternative media, including cult TV, films, music and comics, and storytelling in film and television, including textual analysis and folklore. Diane recently completed her PhD on weird TV, folklore, folk horror and hauntology on television, and massive congratulations to Diane on being a doctor. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. So I don't think that this will be a problem for anybody who's decided to attend this event, but it occurs to me that if you're not a horror fan, then the idea of Christmas horror might seem like a bit of an oxymoron, and my mum certainly doesn't understand it. She's always telling me she doesn't get the connection between Christmas and horror. So I'd like to start by asking where the association between Christmas and horror came from. So where does the concept of Christmas horror originate in kind of folkloric literary terms? And we have a very own folklorist on the panel. So I'm going to start with you, Diane. Where does this association between Christmas and horror come from?
Hello. Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone for your congratulations as well. I'm a doctor as of but a month, so it's the novelty hasn't worn off being called doctor. But yeah, Christmas horror. I was thinking about this, and I think obviously it's kind of obvious connections between short dark nights and sitting around a fire, and traditions of storytelling and almost campfire tales and that kind of thing, but rather than kind of recounting the whole history of that kind of thing, I think that the way we think about it in modern times certainly begins in the Victorian era, where if you think about the ghost stories, like particularly Charles Dickens and M.R. James, it was kind of established as more of a kind of a tradition in Victorian times. I think A Christmas Carol was in the 1840s, somewhere around there, mid 1800s, and Charles Dickens was had a kind of established a tradition of going around and telling these stories, this story particular in person. And of course, he wanted to affect social change. And the aim of the story is quite anti-capitalist, basically. Hurrah! And kind of all that. Be nice to the needy and the poor. And it was kind of born out of that. And he had some of his own horror experiences as well. Famously experienced a very unpleasant train crash and the coming of the Industrial Revolution and all that. So there were a lot of what then were modern horrors and fears coming into the world. So he kind of wrote stories like The Signalman as well, and kind of really spooky stuff. I mean, and even in A Christmas Carol, which we think of as kind of a nice, heartwarming story, it's got really scary, unpleasant bits in it. It's quite frightening. So that tradition of telling stories in person, and I've seen there's people who still go around in person telling these kind of tales. I saw someone in a Victorian chapel a couple of years ago in Sheffield telling this, because it's a short tale, so it's written to be told verbally. And M.R. James did a similar thing, was well known in kind of Cambridge for getting his students around, sitting in his office, grand offices that academics obviously have, with our big stone fireplaces and leather armchairs and things. There was a version, probably a few people might have seen Christopher Lee's Ghost Stories at Christmas in about 2000, I think, where he played M.R. James telling these stories. So again, that verbal tradition in the Victorian era of telling these tales. So yeah, I think that's where our modern association comes on, from those Victorian traditions.
Yeah, and I suppose the oral tradition of kind of myth and legend and telling stories related to kind of the winter season also links to kind of Krampus and the Icelandic Yule cat, which was something I found out about a couple of years ago. This kind of giant cat that goes around stealing children in Iceland at Christmas.
Wow, that's so cool.
Derek, can I hand over to you there?
Yeah, I mean, excellent summary, Diane. So the things I want to pick up on, because when I started writing Haunted Seasons, it was based off the BBC's Ghost Stories for Christmas, and that question of, well, why? First of all, the realization that surely I should go, why ghost stories at Christmas? But it didn't feel wrong. And so I was wondering where it came from. So all of the press and publicity around them would say, or everything people seem to write about Christmas ghost stories said it's an old tradition. So in The Woman in Black, saying the opening there's a line about we're telling ghost stories around the fire. It's an ancient tradition. The Turn of the Screw, it starts with telling ghost stories at Christmas because that's traditional. And I've kept going back, and of course you get to Dickens and A Christmas Carol, 1843, but I think just before then, a couple of years before, or around, another Christmas thing he wrote was called A Christmas Tree, where he says we're telling just memories of Christmas from his childhood. He says, and we're telling stories, ghost stories, or the worse for us. So that association of his childhood with telling ghost stories. And yes, absolutely, whilst Dickens and James, we think about them as oral performance as well, and continuing the oral tradition. But what Dickens is doing is fixing the oral tradition in print for other people, as you were saying, Diane, to then read aloud, rather than an oral tradition in terms of a story that's passed from person to person. If we think back before Dickens, we've got Washington Irving and his Notebooks of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, which include Bracegirdle Hall, where there is an antiquarian. It's a squire who is trying to recreate basically a medieval Christmas. And one of his guests is the local vicar, who is an antiquarian, who's telling local ghost stories. So we're getting that link of ghost stories and the locality and this idea of community. The ghost story he tells is about two local statues, two local tombs with statues of knights on them who get up and walk about on a certain night of the year. Edith Nesbit fans may recognize this story. But before that, we can go back through certainly the 18th century, 17th century, and then you've got, if you widen it out, you're a bit more hazy about the time period, we've got Winter's Tales, which is, I think, where Dickens and so on were looking back nostalgically to Shakespeare, to Marlowe. They're going back even further. Gawain and the Green Knight opens at Christmas, where Arthur refuses to eat until he's had a tale or an adventure or a story of adventure that is relevant to the season. So he's looking for weirdness, really. And if you want to get really vague and kind of dodgy, I think it's Paul Frodsham, the archaeologist, has pointed out that Neolithic burial tombs around Europe are aligned to the winter solstice. And there is evidence, I suspect, not much and lots of interpretation going on, that there were these festivities of the dead around that period. So normally when someone says this is an ancient tradition, you're thinking it's either Victorian or at best late 18th century, that whole period of invented traditions and rising nationalism and cultures. Not this one. This seems to actually be an ancient tradition.
So it goes back a very, very long way then, in that case.
It really does seem to.
So with that kind of folkloric literary tradition established, how does Christmas horror then begin to develop in film and television? And what are the earliest examples to start associating the holiday with the macabre? And actually, Kat, I saw that you tweeted that you've watched a lot of versions of A Christmas Carol. So I wondered if we wanted to start there, because there are some very early versions of that.
I have to admit, I didn't go that far back. The earliest one I watched was the 1951 Alistair Sim version of A Christmas Carol, because I felt like that was a big gap in my knowledge. But earlier than that, just leaving behind Christmas Carol for a few minutes, I did think about what kind of children's horror films are there that maybe aren't Christmas films exactly, but which may have broadcast histories or even have been released around Christmas that we could like make an argument that they are Christmas horror films. So something like Snow White it premiered in December. That's a notoriously terrifying children's film. The Wizard of Oz as well. It wasn't released originally around Christmas, but of course has a broadcasting history of being shown on TV during the Christmas holidays. So I think that there is something interesting there, that even before the idea of the kind of Christmas children's horror film, the way that we think of it now, something like Gremlins or The Nightmare Before Christmas, you did still have those associations being made through broadcasting and releases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what else have we got that comes early on? I mean, I think of Curse of the Cat People, which is sort of inexplicably set at Christmas. But what other early examples have we got? I'm going to throw that out to the panel.
1923. I'm cheating.
Oh, well, your book's disappearing into your background, Derek.
Oh, that's okay. I'm cheating. I'm reading my book. 1923. Recital of A Christmas Carol from the Cardiff and Glasgow transmitters of the BBC. I'm not going to read all of the dates, but remember, 1938 is the first of one of the things that really interests me about Christmas broadcasting, which is a typically non-supernatural program which has some horror in it because it's Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
It was a program called The Pig and Whistle, set in a pub, and had someone telling a ghost story. And that is something that runs all of the way through the bill. I think Casualty's done some, up to Not Going Out. I think it's one of the things that really interests me, that really says to me that there is a cultural link between Christmas and horror, because in the US, those would be Halloween episodes, not Christmas ones.
There's Dead of
Sorry,
Night
Diane.
as well from the 1940s that I always forget has a Christmas story in it, because everybody remembers it for the ventriloquist dummy, which is the reason my son refuses to watch it. He won't watch anything with scary dolls or dummies. But yeah, that's just another, I know it's a bit later, but yeah, it's a mid-40s one that I forget that has a Christmas story in them. It's because it's a portmanteau film for anyone who's not seen it. There is one called The Christmas Party in there.
Yeah, and thinking of those kind of British portmanteau movies as well, it brings me to thinking about Tales from the Crypt and that first adaptation of an All
Joan
Through the
Collins
House,
terrorized by Santa Claus.
Yeah, which seems to be a sort of precursor to the Killer Santa phenomenon, which maybe we'll come to in kind of thinking about this next question, which once we've got Christmas horror as an established concept, it seems to me that it then develops in two separate traditions. I think we've got a British tradition and an American tradition. So I wonder what's distinct about those two kind of strands of holiday horror, and what are the foundational texts. And I think this is the point where we almost have to talk about ghost stories for Christmas, I guess, in terms of establishing that British tradition of Christmas horror. So I'll throw that out to Derek and Diane, but I'd also be interested in knowing what you think the kind of distinctive strands of British holiday horror are versus American holiday horror.
Well, I'll butt in first, if that's all right, Derek, and then you can
Please.
fill in the gaps that I've probably missed wildly. Well, it's interesting. When I was doing my research, I actually interviewed Lawrence Gordon Clark as part of it, and he said it was basically his idea to bring that to the BBC. So the director himself, after A Whistle and I'll Come to You was made as it was an episode of Omnibus in about, I think it was 1968, and then a couple of years later Lawrence Gordon Clark kind of said, well, I want to make a series of this. Let's return to the master of the English ghost story, M.R. James, which is an interesting aside. M.R. James, it's interesting he's known as kind of the master of English ghost stories, because a lot of the folklore in there is actually drawn from Scandinavian folklore. He was a very educated folklorist, so what we accept as British ghosts or English ghosts, actually there's a lot of Scandinavian stuff in there. But yeah, so Lawrence Gordon Clark thought he actually saw Alfred Hitchcock as one of his kind of he wanted to emulate Hitchcock, and thought he was kind of master of horror, which obviously he is. And all that idea of eeriness on screen is really interesting, using particularly, people talk about landscape in folk horror and stuff, but something, as Derek's background evidences, I think what people forget to mention sometimes is the weather. We've got the spookiest, mistiest, coldest weather quite often, the grey skies in which find the general, and all those kind of things as well. So yeah, when it's dark and cold, that Christmas horror weather is perfect. But yeah, so yeah, return to M.R. James because of the whole English ghost story perception, I suppose.
And yeah, Derek.
Yes, there's not much to add to that, but I think that there are reasons that was the right time for those ghost stories as well. It is the 1970s. There's a lot of programming that's going back to the Victorian Edwardian eras, and that's been interpreted as it's that double-pronged approach to nostalgia. Some for some people, it's we want to return to those days when people knew their place and so on. And for other people, it's we can, yes, there was some interesting or some nice bits, but we can learn from it, we move on. And I think the ghost stories, and particularly the way Clarke deals with things like class in Warning to the Curious, is the ghost stories are always ways of commenting on society. They're always about the past being active in the present. And even when the present of the story is our past, there's still that reminder, particularly in James's stories, that these things continue. I don't think there's any of them where kind of, okay, that has completely got rid of the terror. The ghost is gone. So I think Clarke's skill at adapting them really fitted in with that period. And interesting, of course, that he came from documentary as well, and gave that very straightforward view, which fits again with a lot of the literary techniques of being almost transparent narrators. And that is what people keep referring back to. And again, we've got, and I know this is, many people have opinions on the Mark Gatiss revivals, which lean into the nostalgia. They do try to update things. I still would like some other people to get to go, but I am also very glad that he's brought these back. The only thing I would say, at the risk of running on for just the rest of the evening, we do highlight the series that were known as the Ghost Stories for Christmas. They would have just one a year. They were relatively cheap. But there were other Christmas ghost stories around, and we can easily forget that Nigel Neal did 2 of them. In the 70s, The Stone Tape was a ghost story for Christmas. And then, of course, we have his adaptation of The Woman in Black, terrifying people in the end of the 80s.
There's Robin Redbreast as well, which is was a play for today. It was broadcast on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve. If you want a bit of a discussion of Christmas abortion, that's a nice grim British 70s play. I just thought I'd throw that one in there, Derek. Sorry.
No, that's great. But yeah, so I think that there's all of these. If you're thinking about it as a British tradition, it's what's it speaking to, and I think that there is that sense, yes, of tradition, but conveniently, it's also a tradition of something that could be seen as challenging the status quo, the stability. If it says anything about stability of the national identity, it's that it's permanently unstable.
And that's the one thing I wanted to follow up on with that is in terms of how that tradition has developed in recent years. But you mentioned the Mark Gatiss revival, but what about sort of Inside Number 9 and other shows that have kind of played with those kind of that kind of ghost story for Christmas aesthetic and kind of narrative?
Yes, they do, and quite consciously. But again, you're talking about that League of Gentlemen clan, if you like, and who we know shared very similar influences and likes. Yes, we do see it elsewhere, and I do recommend actually that episode of Not Going Out called The House, even if you're not normally because it is everything about those episodes of the non-supernatural series that does the supernatural Christmas special. Victorian house, scary child, all explained away, and then the explanation gets undercut. And it's just a perfect model of it. But is that sense of continuation, which I think is interesting in terms of television, because of how much the television audience is an older audience for linear TV. So, and this may be where we're moving over more into your film area or streamers. Obviously, there is an attempt to get new audiences, to retain young people, to interest younger people. I have a feeling there is also a sense of trying even harder to appeal to nostalgia, to keep the older audience on board with the broadcast linear channels.
Yeah, you'll have to forgive me because the name of the Inside Number 9 Krampus episode has dropped out of my head. But
Devil of Christmas.
Devil of Christmas. It strikes me that is in some ways quite nostalgic, and also is in many ways making fun of those kind of ghost stories for Christmas, and it does end in quite a horrific way, but much of the episode is constructed around kind of taking the piss.
It's also almost directly comparable with an episode of Nigel Neal's series Beasts, The Dummy. There's a lot of similarities taken from that. So if anyone hasn't seen Beasts, watch it. It's mental.
Yeah.
There's a ghost of a dolphin in one episode. That's all you need to know. It's not the best episode, but
sorry.
I think
what is that episode called, Diane? So that we can...
It's called Buddy Boy.
I think you're burying the lead, which is there's a ghost of a dolphin in an episode starring Martin Shaw.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing whether the Bones of St. Nicholas, the Inside Number 9 special this Christmas, is slightly more straight-faced, but I doubt it somehow.
One of the things about the Devil of Christmas is that it's also directly attacking is possibly the wrong word, but engaging with fan culture because of the way it presents itself seemingly as a director's commentary. And it's kind of appealing to that kind of collector's ideal for people who be familiar with that way of approaching media.
So I wonder if Steve or Kat, if you have anything to say about the kind of development of the American tradition of Christmas horror and how it might be seen to be distinct from the British tradition. If the British tradition is kind of indebted to those Victorian ghost stories and then builds through ghost stories for Christmas, and we're still kind of in that kind of ghost story tradition, where does the kind of American tradition start and how does it develop from there? And I know that Steve has spent many weeks watching endless Christmas slashes, which sounds like his partner has been through an ordeal. So do you want to speak to the development of the American tradition of Christmas horror?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that from my perspective, and it is biased by having seen so many slashes recently, is that I'm thinking of it being much more oriented, less around ghost stories and more being influenced by the sort of human killers that followed from Psycho and that sort of interest in human psychosis rather than the supernatural. So I suppose we've got a linking point with, because I think Who Slew Auntie Roo was a British American co-production, which kind of bridges between the two. But following that, there's obviously Silent Night, Bloody Night, which is the precursor to Black Christmas, which is the sort of taken to be the epicenter of Christmas slasher horror, though I think Silent Night, Bloody Night probably should take more credit in that respect. Being followed by, obviously, there's a lot of slasher films then that are focused on particular calendar dates like Friday the 13th and Halloween and Mother's Day and My Bloody Valentine and so forth. But I think that there's a particular obsession with Christmas around those human killers, because not only because of that sort of obsession with calendar dates and the fact that the two films that are like that are both like Silent Night, Bloody Night and Black Christmas are both oriented around Christmas. But there's loads of other horror films around in the 70s and early 80s that have Christmas in the background but don't do anything with it. So it's like Deep Red, for instance, the central killing is based in Christmas, and Maniac is set at Christmas, although it doesn't look like a Christmas film. And so there's this kind of, it seems to be ripe for plundering. And so I think then as you get into the mid 80s or even the earlier 80s, you get more films that seek to exploit what the potentials of Christmas, like Silent Night, Deadly Night. Obviously there's lots of those. Christmas Evil, or the British film, again, Don't Open Till Christmas, which I think is just trying to riff on the American slasher film. Or To All a Good Night, which made me think when Diane was talking about sort of gloomy nights and so forth. One of the oddities about these slasher films is they're all filmed in July, August to meet Christmas deadlines. and a lot of them tried to mask that fact, apart from To All a Good Night, where they're all dressed like they're at a summer camp and everything's shot day for night, and you can see that it's blazing sunshine. It's ludicrous. And David Hess was not a great director, but how good he was as an actor. But even moving beyond that, then you get to the way the slasher influences later American horror. Like, even Scream's release at Christmas is born of the same kind of ethos of using Christmas as a kind of subversive backdrop, of having evil infect the family holiday, as it were. I think that's Scream's counter programming worked so well because of that. But also, as it carries on into what I would call the torture porn cycle, you see the influence of slasher all over the torture porn cycle anyway, but you also see it in picking up on the Christmas theme. So like in films like P2 and ATM and so forth, they all like take that mantle and run with it in a slightly different direction. Or even Lucifer Valentine's Black Mass of the Nazi Sex Wizard, if you're into that kind of thing, is also set at Christmas. But you also see it in the French iteration then of what's happening in American cinema in the new French extremity, in films like Inside or Kim Chaperon's Satan or Calvaire. They're all set at Christmas as well. And I think they're all riffing on the same kinds of things, but for to strip back to the sort of the Italian Giallo influence and so forth. I think that's where we end up, is in this sort of globalized mess, but it's all, for me, comes together oriented around this idea of human killers rather than the supernatural.
Yeah, it strikes me as kind of ironic that Black Christmas is often considered the kind of the proto slasher, but it probably takes the success of Halloween for people to start thinking, oh, we ought to start making slasher films set on holidays, despite the fact that kind of the original slasher is a Christmas. Well, maybe the original slasher. You know much more about this than I do, Steve. And Kat, do you have anything to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I guess to look at the complete flip side to that, you have the more family-friendly Christmas tradition on American television, especially the not horror things like the Rankin Bass Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Charlie Brown's Christmas, and then of course something like The Grinch, which I think is edging a bit further into horror territory. It's got clear kind of overlap thematically with something like A Christmas Carol, and then those kind of would end up influencing something like The Nightmare Before Christmas. I do have a lot more thoughts, as you might imagine, on children's Christmas horror. We can get into that now, or I think you were going to ask something else a bit first, and we can come back to that later if you want to.
Yeah, let's come back to that. But I've just remembered that the Grinch is Boris Karloff, right? Boris Karloff, I think, does
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
So
and I suppose you've got a clear horror link there.
Exactly. And I believe Vincent Price was originally supposed to be the narrator and voice of Santa in The Nightmare Before Christmas. And I wonder if that was also maybe supposed to be a kind of throwback to The Grinch, or if it was just because, Tim Burton was really into Vincent Price. I don't know.
It strikes me that a lot of Christmas media for children that isn't supposed to be scary is actually genuinely quite scary.
We'll come back to that.
Okay. But yeah, for now, Steve, let's get a little bit more into this, the idea of the killer Santa, which is really kind of central to the American tradition of Christmas horror, but also to the slasher film. And obviously it's not an idea that's going away. Killer Santas. We've got Violent Night is out at the moment, where actually Santa is being cast as the hero, but on Friday there's a film coming out on Shudder called Christmas Bloody Christmas, which is about a robot Santa that goes on a rampage in a small town. So why are we so obsessed with rendering Santa as an axe-murdering maniac, do you think?
I mean, let's not forget that in Don't Open Till Christmas, Santas are the targets in Soho.
True.
That's probably the only instance I could find of that. And there's much more focus on Killer Santas. I think there's a lot of reasons why I think it fits quite naturally with the slasher, apart from just because of the influence of Black Christmas and Silent Night, Bloody Night. But the slasher is, like, in order to stand out in what became very quickly in the early 80s a crowded marketplace, that tradition I was talking about, of the slashers being just human killers, started to take on a slightly different connotation, where slashers started to try, the creators started to try and make their slashers stand out by giving them distinctive costumes. And I think that the Santa suit is so instantly recognizable that it kind of fits into that schema, while also having the same kind of thing that Michael Myers' costume does. Like, you can dress up as Michael Myers. It's Halloween, no one's going to bat an eyelid at you, so you can go around killing people. And Santas have that same quality where you can roam the streets slashing people, but you're in a distinctive costume. It's a neat balance, as it were. But it also fits in with this idea of that became part of the slasher very early on, of killers being obsessed with particular dates, calendar dates, not dates that they go on. And there's some, and I think that the reason for that is because the slashers go around killing lots of people, so they've got to be obsessively focused, but you can't have them obsessively focused on one target. So instead you have them obsessively focused on something else, and it happens to be the calendar date. So it gives you a kind of rationale for them going around killing people in an odd way. But I think that fits neatly with Christmas, in the sense that Christmas is so heavily ritualized. Like, it's, if you think what we do at Christmas, it's all based around traditions of opening your presents at a specific time, having dinner at a certain time, watching the Queen's speech, if that's what you do, the King's speech, and obviously. But it's like that kind of obsessive ritualization also works well with the slasher. There's all sorts of other thematic reasons why I think we have killer Santas. One of them's a kind of anti-capitalist thing, which you'll like, obviously. Like I think there's obviously, when we're talking about the Christmas film, we're talking about a move from a kind of religious holiday, although I would note that I would count the Nativity as one of the early horrific Christmas stories, given that it's based around, God or whatever impregnating an impoverished woman. There's a class dynamic there that makes me feel very uncomfortable. Then she's forced to travel across the country because of some sort of bureaucratic edict, and then she's forced to give birth in a stable, and then, which is horrible in itself. And then there's the slaughter of innocents afterwards, and that's all great. And I'm supposed to feel great about this, but it's not often dressed up like that. But I'd count that as quite a horrible story. Anyway,
I did not expect your answer to end up there.
No, well, quite no. We've got to move from that the religious holiday to like it becoming a gifting holiday, and I suppose that Santa's the tipping point of that, because he's supposed to be all about selfless giving. That's what he is, but he represents for children wanting and getting, and that sort of those overtones aren't helped by Santa's associations with Coca-Cola and so forth, which makes it a kind of sort of capitalist holiday or a capitalist symbol. So if you have the Santa as the killer Santa as being a kind of reaction to that, it's exposing that capitalism, like Christmas, is a kind of mass delusion where we all go around thinking we're doing good, but in fact we're doing bad, as it were. And here that's personified by psychotic Santas. I could go on, but that's
we have a comment in the chat from sorry, Diane.
No, it's all right. I was just going to say, I think just following on from that, I think just Santa he's literally, like, as a kid, there's something a bit scary about him anyway, the idea of it, because this old dude who invades your house, like, literally one of the scariest things when you're a kid is the idea of a stranger coming. You're supposed to be afraid of strangers, but here's this stranger who you're not supposed to be scared of, but you're not supposed to see him, or don't let him see you. And there's a lot of, like, he's bringing you presents, but you've got to hide as well. And there's fear kind of drilled into you in a way, directly woven into that. And it's a bit scary. And who is this weird old man coming into my house, and how does he get in anyway? And there's a lot of all that weird stuff is kind of intrinsically scary. And don't be naughty as well, because you might get told, and like getting told off is really scary as a kid. That whole fear of don't let him see you, but you've got to be nice, be a good child. And so there's a lot of fear wound up in the idea of Santa anyway.
And this is where I'm going to hand to Kat, because we've got another comment in the chat that says, agreeing with you, Diane. That's from Paige Allen. Santa is just inherently a bit creepy. Sees you when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake. Fear of being naughty and being punished for it. So what do you think? I mean, we're not talking here about horror films that are aimed at children, but they are playing with a children's character, right?
Oh yeah, and I think that's it's really not surprising when we think about, you know, why did these two things, horror and Christmas, that seem so diametrically opposed, why did they come together? When you look at the history of something like fairy tales and cautionary tales, those are all about using horror to instill a lesson, a moral. So is Santa. You know, it's be good or you're not going to get any presents, be good or you'll get a piece of coal. Of course those things would eventually come together. It just makes sense. Yeah, so there is something, I think there is also just this, sometimes maybe it's also just an easy thing to do, to be like, isn't it subversive and edgy to like have Santa being, you know, violent and crazy? Yeah, I'm sure that I mean, I haven't seen as many slasher films as someone like Steve, so I'm sure that a lot of them are more interesting than that. But I also get the sense that maybe it's just like, you know, it's the obvious sort of thing to go for.
But as me and Steve found out yesterday, actually very controversial, as it turns out. I stumbled across someone had put up a picture of people protesting outside a cinema with you know, Save Santa signs and stuff, and they were pretending this was in relationship to Violent Night, but it was actually from 1984 and Silent Night, Deadly Night. I was asking Steve about this. You want to talk a little bit about that controversy, Steve, which I had no idea about until I stumbled across this on Twitter yesterday?
Yeah, I'd completely forgotten about it until you said that. But like, as far as I can tell, and this would chime with exactly what Kat was saying, is that there's the problem started around a TV ad where, and having seen the TV ad, is just the title on the screen, and then there's images of Santa picking up an axe, and apparently this gave children nightmares, and there was like the Santa, because it was just exposing this sort of creepy Santa thing that's sort of going on in the background. But this led to protests from like concerned parents and parents groups. But then it turned into this kind of pylon where people were finding all sorts of things to complain about it. Like Catholic groups started complaining about the depiction of nuns in the film. Coca-Cola, apparently, according to Variety, were involved at some level, though that was vague. They have a vested interest in the image of Santa, so that became a problem. And I think that it's really took off when Gene Siskel on, you know, Siskel and Ebert, started talking about the film in a really hyperbolic way. He called the advert sick, sleazy, and mean-spirited. He named and shamed everyone involved with the film, including like the director, the writers, the producers, TriStar themselves for distributing the film. And he compared it to I Spit on Your Grave, which I found really surprising, but that's where he went with it. And this all led to, after about like 2 or 3 weeks, TriStar pulling the film entirely. They didn't even release it on one coast. I think it was the West Coast release they pulled. And they were so keen to not be involved with the film anymore that they wouldn't even sell the rights back to the producer, who was saying they'd pay any amount of money to get the rights back, and they just wouldn't sell them back. No, there's two odd sort of end points to this tale, which is the year after TriStar released Santa Claus the movie, and that might look like penance for what they did with Silent Night, Deadly Night, but they already knew they were releasing Santa Claus the movie before they released Silent Night, Deadly Night. And the other oddity is, one of the people apparently who was really keen to have the Silent Night, Deadly Night band was Mickey Rooney, who ended up starring in Silent Night, Deadly Night 5. So I don't know whether he had a change of heart or whether he particularly liked that script. I don't know why he would, or whether just the money was too tempting for him.
It's a good movie, though. I've actually only seen 1, 2, and 5, but 5 is a good movie. Derek, I'm sorry, I noticed you were waving your hand earlier on, and I got a little bit sucked into this discussion. What did you want to add? Sorry.
It's kind of been covered both in the chat with Paige and some of the things that have been said. To kind of make.
Are you afraid of Santa, Derek? Is that where this is going?
I'm not afraid of Santa. I'm afraid of some of the Santas. But one of the things that was kind of hinted at, but be a tiny bit more explicit, Santa is a disguise, as Steve said about the costuming. But there's that uncanniness of, should you recognize this person? As Paige's comment in the chat commented, it's not just, and this is one that's dying out for a minor key rehashing. He knows when you are sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. And this now sounds more like a plea. So be good, for goodness sake. This makes me think of that punishment aspect. And of course, and this is possibly more Diane's place. Various folkloric traditions, like Santa has a companion who will give out the coal or stick you in a sack. In Scandinavia, there's the Yule goat, there's the Yule lads, as well as the Yule cat. I think the Yule goat's one of my favorites, as they, if you don't get, they come and eat your clothes, I think. But I'm also reminded of how this Christmas Santa slasher comes out in American Horror Story. I think it's the 2nd season. Ian McShane as Santa, and just to sum that up, he is a stranger who turns up in your house in the middle of the night and judges you. And that's his job. So yeah, that's where we are.
Well, I think we've thoroughly covered the killer Santa there. What are the other kind of key recurring antagonists that the panel associates with holiday horror? And I guess, you know, thinking about alternative Santas and kind of parts of the Santa myth, we might start with Krampus, or the kind of anti-Santa. And as a side question, why aren't there more killer snowmen horror movies? And I noticed that Johnny Walker isn't here. The only other Jack Frost defender hasn't come to this event. So when he watches this back on YouTube, I shame you, Johnny. But why aren't there more killer snowman movies? But anyway, that's a side question. What are the kind of recurring antagonists you associate with Christmas horror? And I'll throw that one open.
Well, building off of killer Santas, you also have kind of the flip side of that, where it's Santa being killed.
Mm-hmm.
And in there are some children's horror films where it's really interesting that it's childlike figures who are doing the killing or attacking. In Gremlins, a man dressed as Santa, it's not the real Santa, because we know, spoilers, you know, for real life and for Gremlins, we know that Santa doesn't exist, especially not in the world of that film. But there is a Santa being attacked in A Nightmare Before Christmas. I'd completely forgotten that there's a whole song sung by 3 children about how they're going to kidnap Santa Claus and chop him into bits, which is hilarious. And it's just so interesting that those are in films that were intended to be watched by children. Of course, Gremlins was very, very controversial precisely because of some of those reasons. Nightmare Before Christmas, though, I'm kind of thinking, is the idea that children are supposed to identify with these kids singing the song? Are they supposed to see them as bad kids who are not supposed to be doing this? And I think anyone who's familiar with my work and my take on children's horror is that it's probably both, and that's what's fun about it.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, linked to that discussion of kind of killer Santas, when I think of Krampus, it feels like those films are bringing out that idea that he punishes you more so than perhaps some of the Santa stuff, especially the Michael Dougherty version.
I was going to say about that, actually, because it is something, because I watched a Santa slasher last night that I'd not seen before. It wasn't great, I have to say. It was Silent Night from 2012, 2 out of 5 for me, maybe.
He has a flamethrower though, right? At some point.
He has a flamethrower. So. But something, and I'd be interested to know what Steve has to say about this, actually, after just having watched a kind of glut of them, is I was thinking, although the killer Santa is a murderer, so obviously intrinsically bad, he's doing it to people who kind of deserve it in inverted commas. They've been bad, or they've sinned in some way, or they've been greedy, and, you know, it's quite anti-capitalist. You know, a lot of Christmas horror films seem to punish people who don't celebrate the true meaning of Christmas. They don't spend enough time with their children. They're focused on money and greed and presents rather than just hanging out and making cookies or whatever the thing is. And I was thinking, although I wasn't super enjoying the film, it really made me think about that. And I wonder how common that is across other kind of Santa slasher movies, if the people being murdered are complete innocents, or if they've done something wrong in a kind of, being disrespectful to Christmas kind of a way.
I mean, there's all sorts of ways that the different slasher films or more adult-oriented horror films deal with that. Like Silent Night, Deadly Night is all about punishment. It's all about that kind of thing, but it's from this warped perspective. A lot of these films have to do with like have this sort of controversial sort of ruining the holiday thing by associating the killers with either exposing them as children to sex or having them sexually abused. That's a theme that runs throughout a lot of these films, and so that inflects in the way they deal with naughty and nice, and they consider like the loss of innocence and who's been bad or good. I think that sort of skews because they can't really get a grip on what is bad or good. Christmas Evil takes it on directly. Like he spies on children, and he sees like one child reading Penthouse, and he writes a little note in his book saying this child's been bad all year, and there's another girl who's been like playing with dolls or whatever, and she's very good, so she gets a present. But then he goes around stabbing people who've been bad, or people who've been adults who've been lying, and that kind of thing. And again, that manifests in a strange way because he starts to believe he's Santa Claus because his brother told him Santa Claus didn't exist when he was a child, and this kind of thing. It gets a bit messy. The real end of this trajectory is where you get children being targeted specifically, like as Kat was saying. So in like, again, you get that in Silent Night, Deadly Night, but also in Dial Code Santa Claus and that kind of thing. But and that sort of ultimately ends up with this kind of the abortive themed Christmas, depressing Christmas horrors like Inside, especially, which is just all about a kind of forced birth with a knife, and Red Christmas, which has this sort of fetus theme running through it, sort of abortive fetus theme, which is a kind of anti-nativity thing. But also then on the other side, you have the children who are evil, who are being naughty or are being much more naughty at Christmas than they otherwise would be, like you get in the Children, or Kate Egan's favorite Better Watch Out, where you get evil children using the holidays as an excuse to be murderous. And so it kind of splays out in all these different directions that becomes quite messy. Sorry, there's a messy answer.
Well, we're kind of moving into a discussion of thematics here, so I kind of want to throw this out to the panel as a whole. You know, what are the kind of abiding themes of Christmas horror films and television, and what do they have to say about the holiday? And I'll throw that out as a kind of extension of the discussion we've just been having for whoever wants to take the bait.
I can start. I'll throw out a question, which by the time I've finished the rest of my answer, I'm sure maybe someone will have an answer. I don't know any. Are there any zombie Christmas or Christmas zombie movies? As one of the themes that has already been brought out by Steve is about the capitalism aspect, and sometimes the horror of not fulfilling your capitalist duty and buying stuff, but more often that thing of not following the spirit of the season. One of the themes in a lot of the themes in, I would say, around ghost stories, particularly that oral tradition, is that idea of community. And this is where I think I see links between both Christmas horror and Halloween horror, is the sort of social traditions around them are about boundary policing. So in Halloween, you get that with the older traditions of geysers and so on. So you're masked and you're dressed up, not so much actually as pretending to be monstrous or demonic, but to hide your identity, because you're going to pick out who the weirdos are in society and pick on them and blow fire through cabbage stalks through their keyholes. It was a long tradition. I think that Christmas is more about family, at least in the UK tradition, but I think also this has been something that's been picked up in some of the slashers about, certainly comes up in at least one of the Krampus films, about, but which I think it was actually Krampus. Is it that the one? It's about being good family, not just being family, but being good family.
The most recent one, yes, it's about the kid who wishes for his family to all get along, I think, and then he rips the letter up and throws it into the wind, and then Krampus comes and punishes them. Yes,
yeah. That's the one I'm thinking of. And Shelley's pointing out that Santa in Rare Exports is a kind of zombie or servitor to Krampus, which switches things nicely. So yes, family, and as we touched on earlier, kind of cultural national identity and policing of boundaries, but also that, yeah, what do we think is good? What do we think is bad?
Yeah, so those themes around a family, I think, are really, really clear in Michael Dougherty's Krampus, which is very much about a family who hate each other and can't find it in themselves to get on for just one day. And Steve was also talking about kind of the anti-capitalist dimensions of the Christmas horror movie and Christmas horror television earlier on. I wondered if you wanted to expand on that at all, Steve.
Not especially. I suppose that the thing that I just picked up from what Derek was saying was about the family horror film, because I suppose I thought this because of your early comment, Craig, that your mum doesn't get Christmas horror, as it doesn't understand it as a thing. I think it's one of those odd things that my experience of Christmas horror is that it's the kind of thing you would watch with friends rather than your family. So I wonder whether Christmas horror, in the type of horror I'm watching anyway, is a kind of reaction to the kind of schmaltzy Christmas familial film where you watch it with your friends, your alternative, your chosen family, rather than the family you're forced to be with, and whether it's a kind of anti-family thing in that respect. And I suppose that would explain why so many the films that I'm watching certainly focus on separation, isolation, loss, psychosis, and so forth, because Christmas is a really hard time for a lot of people, right? And we have on the one side this sort of schmaltzy ideal of what Christmas is, and it's all getting together in community and family and so forth. And then on the other extreme end, we have these psychotic loners going around stabbing people. And maybe it's a kind of a gainsaying, a reactionary gainsaying. It's not exactly It's a Wonderful Life, but it's kind of that depressing other side of Christmas that maybe doesn't get spoken about and gets articulated in this kind of other horrific way.
Yeah, Derek.
Just to on that idea of what that reminded me of is that you can think of certainly the television ghost stories in particular, or television horror, as rites of passage. You know, the ghost stories for Christmas on the original run were mostly shown at around 11:30 on Christmas Eve night. Who's staying up then? That's not for the kids. It might be for the parents. It might be for the teens and young adults who are heading out with their friends and are going to be coming back in from the pub at that time. So being up at that time, being allowed to stay up, particularly on Christmas Eve, that's a rite of passage. And obviously there's stuff about seeing horror films as being rites of passage as well. I had remembered something else what Steve was talking about. I've completely forgotten again now. So,
well, this seems like a good place to segue to Kat and also to the greatest film ever made, Gremlins, which I think has a lot to say about family and capitalism and a lot of the things that we've been talking about here. Although we don't just have to talk about Gremlins, but what do horror films specifically for children have to say about what should be the most wonderful time of the year, do you think?
Well, I mean, one of the clear things I learned from watching so many adaptations of A Christmas Carol, multiple versions of The Grinch, and The Nightmare Before Christmas, is that they all really, as we've mentioned, they use horror to really reinforce the values of Christmas. It's all about scaring you into being a better person. And they reaffirm those values of Christmas, generosity, giving, family, community. And I found it quite, you know, as someone who likes both horror and Christmas, it was almost quite disappointing to realize that, with one exception, which I will come to, the best film ever made, really there is a kind of separation that's reinforced between horror and Christmas by the end of the films. Once the Scrooge or the Grinch or whoever has learned to embrace Christmas, the horror's gone. There's no more ghosts, no more scary things, with the slight exception of Nightmare Before Christmas. But even then, that's really all about Jack sort of learning that Halloween's really great, and he you know, that separation between Christmas and Halloween, there's still a little bit of overlap because it snows in Halloween Town, but they're still mostly kind of separated again. Of course, in Gremlins, what makes Gremlins great and also what made it really, really controversial was the fact that it's not enforcing that separation, and it's not using horror to reinforce the values of Christmas. It's really using horror more in the way that we would see in something like Black Christmas or other slasher horrors, where it's about revealing the kind of the less wholesome aspects of Christmas. It's really cynical about Christmas, about all of the kind of Reagan era values, about commercialism and capitalism. And something that I found really interesting as well, digging into the BBFC reports about Gremlins at the time. Of course, it was rated a 15 here, which was more restrictive than in the US, where it was a PG. And the fact that it was set at Christmas and was really attacking Christmas was brought up in every single one of the reports. The examiners basically found it quite disturbing, and they thought that children themselves would end up being quite disturbed by the film. And just as an extra fact to add on to that, I do think it's really funny that Gremlins was released in America in July, which, why would you do that, Warner Brothers? Crazy decision. But then in the UK, it was released a lot later in December, and the report is dated in early December. So I do also have to wonder if they took that into account and they were thinking, we know that children, if we rate it a PG, we know that children are going to see this really close to Christmas, potentially seeing it on the same day as like going to Santa's grotto and sitting on Santa's lap after just having seen it, you know, found out in the most horrible way possible that Santa's not real. And I do have to wonder if they took that into account as well, even though it's not kind of explicitly said in the reports.
Yeah, and building on Steve's point earlier about the kind of anti-capitalism of Christmas horror movies, I think the thing about Gremlins that speaks to a lot of other Christmas horror is that idea of consumption, right? I mean, the monster at the center of Gremlins is designed to consume and destroy everything it encounters, and of course, part of the way that you turn them into gremlins is by feeding them after midnight, and that whole idea of consumption. And it strikes me that a lot of Christmas horror, and I think starts with Gremlins and maybe builds outwards, is about the idea of the holiday being turned into a consumerist jamboree where we all just spend a shitload of money on things we maybe don't need. And a lot of the films speak to that, I think. So we're going to move into the Q&A section of this in a second, but we've kind of talked a lot about the kind of history of Christmas horror. We've talked about a couple of important contemporary examples, but there has been a massive explosion of Christmas horror production and obviously horror production more generally in the 21st century. So I wonder what the panel thinks have been the most significant developments in seasonal horror, film and TV over the last 20 years. Are there any new kind of strands or themes that have developed? And I'll kick that off by saying that I think that idea around consumption and consumerism has become even more apparent in recent examples. I think of the recent Black Friday, which came out last year, I think, which is about an alien invasion that happens on Black Friday, and the shoppers coming in to buy toys for their kids have turned into, in fact, almost zombies, Derek, in fact. So yes, there's one for you. But kind of alien parasite zombies. There's the beginning of Krampus, of course, which, although most of the film is around family, the very beginning of it is that it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas while people fight over Black Friday deals. And there's an episode of Into the Dark, which is the Blumhouse TV series called Puka, which is about a guy who is hired to be sort of the dressed up mascot for a new Christmas toy, and he allows it to start taking over his personality, and he becomes a sort of serial killer in himself. But I wonder if any of you have got 21st century favorites or any kind of themes or strands you've seen develop. Sorry, Diane, over to you.
Yeah, no, while you were talking, I just thought of a perfect one that both you and I think, have seen recently at Celluloid Screams, if anyone's seen The Leech.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Which I was just thinking, if anyone's not seen it, do see it when you get a chance. It's very briefly, in essence, there's a kind of priest who offers a room and board to a kind of, is it homeless? A guy,
they're a homeless couple.
A guy off the street who ends up also bringing his girlfriend to stay in the house, and all sorts of depravity and hilarity ensues, and involving the priest and a lot of times. But I was just thinking while you were saying, Craig, how that is almost like perfect for the cost of living crisis, and people can't afford to heat their own homes, and that whole, it's kind of home invasion, but they're like, he's doing something kind for these people in poverty, basically. He takes these people in. And although it's very funny and there's lots of drinking and drug taking and all sorts of crazy stuff, that idea that then they won't leave, and what do you do then? And it's, you know, that idea of, yeah, just trying to help someone out and giving them food and a warm place to stay, and then that going horribly wrong. That just sums up Britain today, I think. Even though it's an American film, but you know, it's I think it's very, very funny, but also I'd not really thought about it in that context till you were just saying. So
yeah, I think that on one hand it's got a lot of themes around capitalism and charity and all that kind of stuff, but then there is also the angle, and this relates to some stuff that Steve's been talking about throughout this conversation. One of the only reasons he lets them stay is because he finds out the girlfriend is pregnant and is thinking about having an abortion, and he desperately wants to stop her from doing that. So there's the kind of themes around capitalism and philanthropy, but also around religious piety and wanting to kind of,
yeah, because he's going to say, he thinks he's going to save them, and there's, yeah, of course that ties in with all the political stuff in America that's going on at the moment. Yeah, it's as well, so.
And made during the pandemic, actually, so quite prescient in that regard, in terms of the way it's speaking to kind of Christian nationalism and the abortion debate, and well, it shouldn't be a debate, of course, Roe versus Wade. Anybody else got any kind of 21st century favorites, or any kind of things to say on where Christmas horror film and television has moved in the 21st century?
I'll just pick up on Paige's comment of Black Mirror's White Christmas in there, which is of course great. But I think that well, I looked at the media pack for this Christmas for the BBC. I've not looked at ITV or Channel 4 yet, but whilst there's Mark Gatiss's production of Count Magnus, and Mark Gatiss also in a first stage version of A Christmas Carol, which will be on BBC 4. So far, that's kind of it for horror. And I do wonder if the increasing pressure from streaming and its internationalization and transnationalization, the Netflixization of media, is leading to a decline in kind of television horror. So it becomes these niche things. Yes, you mentioned there is going to be another Inside Number 9, but it does kind of feel like you've got to be Mark Gatiss or Pemberton and
I was going to say, we do have a new Mark Gatiss joint this Christmas, I think.
Yeah, Count Magnus.
Yeah.
I was wondering, with things like Krampus, and you mentioned that sort of Christian nationalism, this is actually something that is kind of going a bit off topic from what you'd asked, but I wonder if Diane's got some thoughts on this. Are things like Krampus and those kind of connections to older traditions, are they part of that worrying, or depending on which side it's done, that reclamation of the past, that reclamation of cultural identities, which obviously is interesting, can be fun, but can also be deeply scary ethno-nationalist stuff?
I will just say, before Diane answers that question, that we have just over 15 minutes left. So if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat and we'll come round to them. Diane.
I'm not sure if this is directly answering it, but I was kind of thinking about it when somebody mentioned rare exports earlier, and I was thinking about how the Krampus in that feels like a bit of a force of nature, because is he in a mountain or something, and it's kind of coming. And obviously I love Godzilla, and you know, creatures coming out of mountains and coming back to get us. I just had to show you all my jumper again. But yeah, that is almost like nature coming back to get us. We can't, well, the whole environmental themes coming back to the themes again. I guess it could be an element of that. Or I recently watched Troll as well. I know it's not a Christmas film, but then I very much enjoyed the new Troll film, and it felt like very much in the same vein as Rare Exports and the Kong Skull Island and all the Godzilla movies. So that kind of almost like the things are coming up out of the earth to get us. I don't know if that's exactly what Derek was asking, if you're talking about kind of almost cultural appropriation of other legends a little bit more, because it does feel like the Krampus legend has been a bit of a trend. It was like, oh, that's a new thing we can capitalize on and use and repurpose. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a better answer than that. I'm waffling a bit now. I'll leave some space for questions. So interesting to think about.
We've just had a question in from Lindsay Hallam, actually, which she's happy for me to read out. She asks, the traditions in Britain and the US have been discussed, but I wanted to know more about Christmas horror traditions in Scandinavia, as that seems to be very prevalent as well. Anybody want to take that one?
I only know a little bit in terms of what I've researched, in terms of kind of what M.R. James looked into, and that was particularly in terms of ghosts. But I know the ghosts are quite different to the British ghost tradition. I think they're a little bit more malevolent, and there are different types of hauntings. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm wildly unprepared for this evening, so I am just waffling a bit. But yeah, there's definitely different types of ghost traditions and hauntings and ghosts. There's the idea of a ghost haunting a physical place is kind of a relatively modern perception. Ghosts were used to be just more attached to people, and I don't know if that comes from Scandinavia or that was kind of picked up on by M.R. James, but there are definitely ghosts. If you think about the idea of people had ideas of seeing spirits of their parents who'd passed over or stuff like that, and it was kind of almost a nice thing rather than ghosts being well, nice might not be the right word, but kind of comforting, or knowing that somebody's watching over you, that kind of thing. But the kind of notion of ghost haunting and being more malevolent, I think, is more in the Scandinavian tradition. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, James, as you were saying, picked up on not just Scandinavian, but also English medieval ghost story traditions, translating famously the Byland manuscript. Or noting it anyway. And what he did was, both from the Scandinavian and the medieval traditions, very physical revenants, almost more than ghosts, although there's also boundary ghosts and ghosts of old people, but tying into that particular Christian tradition of ghosts as warnings. Carry on the way you're going and look what will happen to you, as well as occasionally as vengeful spirits. So that ties in again very nicely with Christmas, and that warning, be good or else. I think the Scandinavian stuff does tie in to the way, certainly in the UK over the past 20 years or so, there seems to have been this greater connection with Scandinavian culture, Scandi Noir and so on, and hygge, everyone embracing hygge and getting their big mugs of hot chocolate with marshmallows in. So we mentioned the Yule cat, which I can't remember exactly what the Yule cat does. Can you, Craig, did you mention that one?
Steals children, I'm pretty sure.
Steals children,
yeah. I think it's something really weird though, like to do with not their behavior, but I think it's a tradition in Iceland for children to be given clothes on Christmas Eve, and like if they're not given clothes, they get eaten, which is, if anything, more terrifying, because then like the child doesn't really have any control over that.
Yeah, because the cat is supposed to be owned by a giant, and it's the giant's children that give people clothes, if I remember rightly.
Are they the Yule boys?
Yes, I think so.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Because there's the Yule boys, who are also this kind of mischievous bunch, and then there's the Yule goat, which I think also, which gets closer to your house each night up to Christmas. And yes, you're supposed to, if you don't get new clothes, then something horrible happens. I can't remember. Eats all of your old ones, thereby leaving you cold and freezing for the rest of the season.
I just remembered there was elves as well. If anyone saw that there was a TV series on Netflix last year set at Christmas, and that was something I hadn't seen. I don't recall seeing before. Is using the folklore about elves, and yeah,
there is an absolutely dreadful mid-90s movie called Elves, which Steve has clearly seen from that solemn little nod there, which I do not recommend. Megan Kenny has a question, and she's happy to ask it on camera. So do you want to come and ask that question, Megan?
Oh, yeah, hold on. Oh, there we go. Oh,
There we go.
there we are. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, when you were talking about films being like anti-capitalist and very much pushing against this, but I've been to see Violent Night today, so it's quite fresh in my mind, and I loved it. I thought it were amazing. But I was just thinking, actually, really, it just reinforces that, because he saves the capitalists, really. So he like restores the status quo to these, you know, nefarious capitalistic overlords. And just thinking about like nihilism in Christmas horror, and I wonder if that's part of what's so appealing, because you get this very like sickly sweet, you know, holly jolly narrative, and whether like things like Krampus, which in my opinion, I have to disagree, Craig, I think that's the finest Christmas horror ever made, but you know, we can agree to disagree, and fantastic, because I love Krampus and I just think Krampus is amazing anyway. But like that ending is so dark, like it's so bleak, and it's not what you're expecting. And I think is that part of the appeal of it, that you get that quite dark, full of terrors sort of ending to things that is a nice contrast to the really sickly, you know, rocking around the Christmas tree sort of narrative.
I have to admit that I've been watching the trailers for Violent Night for many a week, because it seems to be on in front of everything. And I do keep thinking to myself, am I supposed to be cheering for these people? They've got $300 million in a vault beneath their house.
Yeah.
Like, redistribute this money. You know, let
Yeah,
them take it.
Yeah,
I
and I
haven't
think
seen the film yet.
the difficult thing as well is I really love John Leguizamo as well. So I was like, yeah. And then I thought, no, he's a baddie. But then when you watch film, you're like, is he a baddie, or is he a product of capitalist society? You know, who's the villain? So I don't know. I think, yeah, I just wondered if that sort of dark narrative to it is just appealing. I mean, it is to me. So
I certainly think so, and that's one of the things I really love about Krampus, that it is so dark and nihilistic, and that it doesn't end well. But I'll pass to the rest of the panel. I mean, Steve watches an awful lot of nihilistic Christmas movies.
Yeah, I mean, that's like that's one of the reasons I like Silent Night, Deadly Night, the first one, so much, is because it's really quite mean-spirited. Like the first 10 minutes are really pretty horrible, and it doesn't get much better from there. So I think that's, and I see it as that kind of antidote to that schmaltzy, you know, Lifetime rom-com deluge that you get elsewhere. That there's got to be something for people like me at Christmas that that want to watch these depressing, horrible films.
Well, I saw a film at Soho Horror Film Festival last year called Letters to Satan Claus, which is done in the Hallmark style. It's Hallmark aesthetic, it's a Hallmark narrative, but it just very slowly turns into something utterly horrific, where Satan turns up in this town and starts torturing everybody. And yeah, I think there is something really appealing about films that subvert the schmaltziness of a lot of other Christmas horror movies, definitely. Anybody else want to chip in on that one before we
Well, I think Steve summed it up really nicely earlier when you were talking about the nihilistic spirit, and it is, I think a lot of people do feel very isolated at Christmas, and it's not always a nice time for everybody, and can be quite bleak and dark, and the kind of sense of nihilism and bleakness in Christmas horror is a way of sticking two fingers up to the Christmas machine that society has become, you know. And it's like, I do love Christmas, but I hate a lot of it's too much sometimes, and you kind of think, I just want something a bit murdery today now. You know? And some of us find that comforting because we like horror, but you know, it is a way of kind of, I've had enough of the schmaltz for one day, and not everybody's having a nice time. There are bleak things in the world. So yeah.
Did any of you see last year's I think it was called Silent Night, but not Flamethrower Santa Silent Night, but the one that is essentially a complete satire of Richard Curtis movies, where a bunch of British character actors come together in a house. And it's only about, this is a kind of a spoiler, but I have to say it, otherwise what I'm saying doesn't make sense. About half an hour into the movie, you realize that it's everyone's last day on Earth and the apocalypse is coming, and they're having their last Christmas, and it all turns horribly depressing. And it's all written in the Richard Curtis style, and it's such a great send-up of movies like Love Actually. We've got another question. This one's from, I need to just scroll up a little bit. Oh, it's from Laura Me. The panel touched upon the idea of Christmas and Santa as inherently creepy and Christmas time as bleak, and was thinking about that in relationship to Christmas films which aren't horror but have pretty dark themes of violence or violence or horror elements. It's really varied from Trading Places to Scrooge to Home Alone even. Any more thoughts about non-horror Christmas films and TV that are just a little bit horrible?
I won't say too much because I've already talked a lot, but I just want to say Scrooged is my favourite Christmas film of all time, and I have to watch it every year.
I wonder if this is where I can shoehorn in a reference to Watership Down, which I'll bring up wherever possible. But that you know, it sparked controversy a couple of years ago for being shown on Easter Sunday, but it also has a tradition of having been shown at Christmas. And of course, the 2018 remake was broadcast around Christmas as well. And that's something that is quite horrific and traumatizing for many people. We wouldn't really call it a Christmas film, but it does also have those kind of mythological elements as well that perhaps mean it is quite suited to Christmas. Also, I've been invaded by my own Yule cat as well, quite appropriately.
I just say I'm really glad that you just said all of this about Watership Down cat, because as soon as I saw Laura's question, I thought this is my chance to ask: is Watership Down a Christmas film?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we can say that it is, but also I think it draws into question, like, what do we consider a Christmas film, full stop? I think there are loads of like family films and that in my head are Christmas films just because they're the kind of films that you watch around Christmas. I think of the Star Wars films as Christmas films, which doesn't really make any sense apart from like in my head. So I think you can potentially expand the whole category of children's or of Christmas horror to include a whole bunch of things that don't technically take place at Christmas or are technically even horror. Maybe It's a Wonderful Life a horror film? Because like some pretty horrible and grim stuff happens in that.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty horrific. So
it's about, you have to accept your position in society. Don't have ambition is the message of that film.
Very true. We've got a couple of minutes left, so just a couple of more things that I want to touch on before we finish. First of all, very quickly, I would like each member of the panel to recommend an obscure or unseen horror film or a Christmas horror film or episode of a television show that they would like everyone to go and have a look at this Christmas season. Let's start with Diane.
Well, I think Steve mentioned this earlier, but I'd say Who Slew Auntie Roo, if you've not seen it. I only came across that by accident on Amazon Prime a few months ago and didn't know it was a Christmas film. It's great. Shelley Winters in the 70s, Mark Lester, but also familiar as Oliver from the musical. That's great. And a more modern one, I'd say A Christmas Horror Story, where William Shatner plays a DJ, and it's a portmanteau film, and it's a lot of fun. So both of those.
Kat?
Oh, I'm really basic. My favourite is The Muppets Christmas Carol. But
I mean, we can't go wrong.
Yeah, I was really glad that I went back and watched some of the older Christmas carols, like the Alistair Sim one from 1951. If A Muppets Christmas Carol didn't exist, I think it would be the best one. And just in relation to horror, it seemed to me like it a lot of the time had a kind of German expressionist kind of aesthetic to it, which I just thought was really cool. So yeah, if you've not seen that, you should watch that, and also The Muppets Christmas Carol, because it rules.
Steve?
Mine's easy. Silent Night, Deadly Nightfall. Brian Usner film with Screaming Mad George doing effects, right? So you can't go wrong. It has absolutely nothing to do with any of the other films in the series, which makes it a great sequel. It follows a Jewish protagonist, and they make sure she's a Jewish protagonist, which means she's removed from Christmas. So we are as well. There's barely any Christmas in it, and which is a baller move for a film called Silent Night, Deadly Night. It has Clint Howard with a giant animatronic maggot. It has attempted child sacrifice. It has multiple instances of spontaneous combustion. What more could you want?
I mean, that's a hell of a sell, that is, Steve. And Derek?
How do you follow that? It's a fairly common recommendation, and it going way back to the 70s and the Dead of Night series, and I'm going to recommend The Exorcism, which is a bunch of proto-yuppies in their country cottage facing up to exploitative capitalism and their heritage there, and it's brilliant. Although there's one camera angle I would have done differently, because it's during the a long and excellently performed performance of a monologue, but you can see right up someone's nose whilst they're delivering it, and it's not distracting. There we go. That's the one to watch.
I'm going to recommend a film that Kate Egan brought up before we started this session, which is Better Watch Out, or what was the original title? Something to do with neighborhood or something. I can see why they changed the name. Better Watch Out is the darkest possible version of Home Alone, and just shows you just how horrible rich kids can be. And on that note as well, I was going to phrase this as a question, but we're out of time. So one thing I do want to acknowledge is that seasonal horror is generally kind of dominated by Christian holidays for the most part, and we don't think enough, I think, about seasonal horror in other senses. So one thing, and I think Amy Nisa said something about this in the chat earlier on, I would like to encourage everybody to go away and watch Hanukkah from 2019 and Hebrew Hammer, which is a hilarious, which are two kind of Hanukkah themed movies, as I think that holiday horror is definitely something that we ought to kind of diversify and decolonize a little bit. It's very dominated by Christian holidays, and as Steve has said many times throughout this conversation, that can be quite problematic. Yes, Derek.
Very quickly, if I can. On that point, when I was doing my seasonal horror research, I found out that in Korea and Japan, and I've since found out in China, the season for ghost stories is summer. That's when they've got their festivals for ghost storytelling, because that's when you want to be chilled.
Excellent. And yes, Kat, I want a Yule Cat movie as well. I would very much like to see a Yule Cat movie. And on that note, we're at 8:30. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Derek, to Steve, to Kat, and to Diane. That was a fantastic discussion. I very much enjoyed it. Thanks very much to Laura, Shelley, and Kate for having us. And I will call it to an end there. If I assume one of the BAFTSS conveners will pop back up in a second.
I can pop back up. Thank you so much, everybody, for a fantastic discussion. It was really interesting, and I think everybody's got lots of excellent, frightening, festive recommendations to take away with them. So that's great. So yeah, wishing everybody the happiest, gruesomest season. And we'll be back in 2023 with some new events and various other things. So keep an eye on our social media and what have you. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks to all our panelists, and thanks to Craig for excellent sharing as well.
Oh,
thanks
you.
Everybody. See
and
you
the last
again.
thing to say, of course, which I forgot to say, is just happy, have a good break, have a nice Christmas. I mean, that's what we've been talking about for the happy holidays, as we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. Cheers, folks.
Thanks, everybody.